Hi, this is Julia Walker with Grey Duck Forge, and today we're going to be talking about the categories and types of joints that farriers should know. There are three broader categories dealing with what the joints are made out of, and then in one category there are three separate types dealing with how those joints move. So we'll talk about all that in detail, so hopefully it will be memorable for you and helpful in your studying. With that, let's continue. Firstly, we'll talk about the three big categories of joints that we farriers should be aware of. This is more of a broad strokes classification. Basically, the categories are broken apart based on what is the joint made of. So, if the joint is made out of a ligament, like just bone 1 plus ligament plus bone 2, that is a ligamentous joint. If the joint is made out of cartilage, so bone 1 plus cartilage plus bone 2, that is a cartilaginous joint. And then if the joint involves a capsular ligament and joint fluid and all that, joint fluid being like synovial fluid, then that is called a synovial joint. So those are the three categories. We'll start with ligamentous joints. They are a pretty simple form of joint with a basic connection of bone, ligament, and bone. The most common version of this that we deal with as farriers on occasion is the joint between the splint bones and the cannon bone. The ligament that is found there is called the interosseous ligament. It's a good structure to be aware of. The tibia-fibula connection is another connection and a connection within the pelvis are also places where there are ligamentous joints, but those are a little higher up the leg than we farriers typically deal with. So the main one is the cannon bone and the splint bones that we need to know. Cartilaginous joints are also pretty basic, just bones and cartilage. There are different types of cartilage too. Hyaline cartilage, which is like the most basic type of smooth cartilage, and then fibrous cartilage, which has fibers running through it. But any type of cartilage is fair game for a cartilaginous joint. Growth plates are technically an example of a cartilaginous joint, even though they're connecting parts of the same bone. Between vertebra and the spine, the connections are also solid pieces of cartilage. We know them as discs. And the joints between the ribs also have permanent cartilage connecting the bones as well. So those are some examples of cartilaginous joints. Hopefully you're getting a pretty good idea of what these joints are about. They are categorized by their structure, basically like what the joint is made out of, cartilage, ligament, or synovial stuff. So that last category of joints being synovial joints, those take a few different forms, but the best way to tell if it's a synovial joint, rule number 1, does it have synovial fluid? And yeah, they are the most important joint that we work with and the most common joint in the horse. Their anatomy is a little more complicated than cartilaginous and ligamentous joints, so I'll break that down properly in a future video. But think like capsular ligament, collateral ligaments, that synovial membrane, articular cartilage on the ends of bones, and that synovial fluid. All that together, lots of structures. And there are, within the broader category of synovial joints, three types that we need to know. Ginglymus, or some people say ginglymus, arthrodial, and enarthrodial joints. Those are the fancy science names of those three types of joints, but there are more common names that you might know for the three types of synovial joints. So ginglymus joints are also known as hinge joints. Arthrodial joints are also known as plane joints. And enarthrodial joints can be referred to as ball and socket joints. So we will start with the ginglymus joints, or hinge joints. They are a synovial joint, first and foremost. They articulate the same way a hinge does in like a fixed direction. So kind of like they can either go this way or they can go that way. And otherwise they're pretty limited. So there isn't really a lot of room for like twisting, and definitely not a lot of like sliding or dealing with shear forces very well. They're really more just for like flexing and extending limbs. And we see a lot of them in the leg, like the fetlock joint and the pastern joint for sure. The coffin joint kind of, but with an asterisk because it has some plane joint characteristics, having that navicular bone in there. So, but definitely fetlock joint and pastern joint for sure. I remember that the ginglymus joints are hinge joints because of how they're spelled. Like those first four letters, G-I-N-G, I kind of think like ginge, like ginger, and hinge kind of sound the same. So ginglymus, ginge, hinge. Cool. Then we can move on to arthrodial joints, or plane joints. They are also synovial joints, but they have a little different form and function from hinge joints. They typically involve short bones, those small cube-shaped bones, and have kind of like wide planes of bones inside of them, either by like smaller bones or kind of wider, flatter bones. But yeah, they are built to allow a limited amount of like gliding and sliding. And, you know, they are also built to handle like shock absorption well, so kind of like stretching and like compressing a little bit. And the knee joint or the carpus is sort of like the farrier's classic example of an arthrodial joint, but like I said before, like the coffin joint can also kind of be considered to be a little bit of one of them, according to Gregory's textbook. So I remember arthrodial equals plane by remembering that King Arthur lived in England, and if I wanted to go to England, I'd have to get on a plane, arthrodial plane. Cool. It's all I have. It's something distinctive, at least. I don't know. Otherwise, it's like arthritis. Yeah, whatever. So Arthur, England, plane to get to England. Cool. And the last type of synovial joint that we're looking at is the enarthrodial type, or the ball and socket type of joint. That would be in horses basically the hip joint or coxofemoral joint, but the shoulder joint also is technically, according to the Gregory textbook, one, which is that scapulohumeral joint. They allow the bone with the ball on it to swivel kind of in a large range of directions, which means that we can thank enarthrodial joints for giving horses the ability to kick sideways when that hip joint comes up and around. Cool, I know. But when I try to remember what enarthrodial joints are, I think of like the enarthrodial joints involve a ball going in a socket. So N equals in is sort of the way that I remember that. And that takes us all the way through the main ways to distinguish a joint. So we have the three categories, like what the joint is made out of. So if there is a ligament, cartilage, or a synovial structure. And then we have the three types of synovial joints, which is like how it moves. So as a hinge, like with the ginglymus joint, as a set of planes, like with that arthrodial joint, or as a ball and socket, like enarthrodial joints. It's good to know all this to improve your literacy as a farrier and to understand what the vet is telling you when a horse has a problem. You never know when you'll need to know this stuff exactly, but it's also especially important to know when taking exams. But yeah, with that, we are all done. Up next, we'll be diving into the joints within the knee and hock, sort of supplementing that joint naming conventions video to include the last couple that kind of went beyond the scope of the original video. But in the interest of being thorough, we'll work through them in the next one. As usual, any feedback or corrections are always appreciated, and if you have any sort of any of those, feel free to pop them in the comments section below. I appreciate you tagging along for another technical topic like this. Hopefully this helps put a simple image in your mind and makes the subject matter a little more memorable and less complicated. So, as always, thank you and stay tuned for more.